Hello street photographers, Brian from Street Snappers here, with a short presentation with lots of tips on how to really elevate your street photography. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a Fujifilm X photographer, in other words an ambassador, and I'm a full-time professional street photographer. I run street photography workshops across the UK and Europe, and I've written 2 best-selling street photography books. And it's probably time for a quick plug. 52 Assignment Street Photography and Mastering Street Photography. So I meet a lot of people who perhaps struggle a little bit with street photography, and that could be because their approach isn't quite right, or maybe the nerves take over and there's a lack of confidence holding them back, or very commonly they're overthinking it and maybe expecting too much. So if any of this sounds familiar, stay tuned for 10 hot tips on how to elevate your street photography. My first tip then is all about gear, and you really must keep it simple. I'll typically use one of 2 cameras for street photography. This little Fujifilm XF10, which is really underrated, it's great value. This is with me wherever I go and whatever I'm doing. It's got a fixed 18mm lens, which is 28 equivalent, 24 megapixel sensor. It's so small, this is always in my pocket. And the great thing is, I'll never look like a photographer with this, I just look like a tourist. So moving it up a step, my day-to-day street photography camera, my go-to camera is the X100V. And this, in its latest iteration, is just about perfect in every way for a street camera. I won't go into all the technical stuff because it's been said so many times in so many places. But if you ever buy one camera for street photography, this one should certainly be on your shortlist. I like to travel light when I'm doing street photography, so I'll use the smallest possible bag I can get away with. Again, I don't want to look like a street photographer, so I use something like this, which isn't really a camera bag, but it's a great day bag. It won't draw attention to you, and it carries just about enough stuff. If I'm carrying more gear, I'll take something bigger, and I use something like a Peak Design messenger bag. But keep it simple. Minimum gear. You don't need loads of gear for street photography. So tip number 2, learn to read the streets. To be a good street photographer, you need to be streetwise, to understand what's going on around you and to make sense of it all. Most people just see loads of clutter with not much interesting happening. Street photographers need to really see what's going on around them. So we need to develop great observational skills and a real sense for detail. But what else do I mean by reading the streets? Well, first of all, stay alert. You never know what's around the corner. Never hesitate. You just don't know what you're going to come across on the streets. Study the light, become a light hunter. Study body language. You need to really be able to predict what's going to happen next. Really watch people. You need to find detail. Detail is really important, and I'll talk in a while about connections, but finding the detail, making connections is brilliant, and you will create things like visual metaphors, like this fork in the road, by the way. Go fishing. You may have heard of the fishing technique. This is where we find our ideal background and wait for as long as it takes for the right subject to present itself to make the frame complete. It's a really popular approach in street photography, although for me, I don't really have the patience to linger too long. I know people who will wait for an hour for a shot. I will maybe wait 5 or 10 minutes, and that's it. And finally on this, slow down. Really, really walk slowly. Look all around you. Take a 360-degree view of the world. If you're walking slowly, you'll see more of what's going on, you'll hear more, you'll smell things. You'll just become really tuned into your environment. So leading on from this, my third tip is make connections. This is really important. You need to find things in your frame that connect to each other. It could be any combination of people, things, foreground, background, and so on. But you really should be aiming to connect them to produce something interesting. In this shot, the simple juxtaposition provides the connection. And in this one, we're making a simple connection between the sign and the poor bird. And here's another one which connects a word, a simple word, with things going on around it. So make connections. The fourth tip, and this may sound really obvious, but shoot interesting stuff. Shoot interesting things. How often do you see a really boring image and you think to yourself, how is this street photography? A guy sitting on a bench, somebody walking past Sainsbury's, somebody just sitting in a cafe. There's nothing interesting about these things. And it's our job as street photographers to make the world look interesting. We often see an image of somebody walking through a beam of light or past a brightly coloured wall. But is it really interesting enough? Well, it could be, but often it needs another element that elevates it from the mundane to the interesting. It could be something funny. It could be something evocative, ironic, sad, whimsical, hilarious. It could be something really small, like this guy's ear flaps which got caught by the wind, or the shadow on this woman's face. Or maybe it's just a scene which you think is a lovely composition, like this one, or this one that has more of an abstract quality. What I try to look out for, though, is a real sense of the unusual in the usual. Something that would be mundane, but it becomes interesting because something just shouts at you to take a second look. And that's what it's all about. So tip number 5 is to use projects to bring a real sense of focus and purpose to your work. People who are new to street photography often struggle to find an interesting subject. And we can walk the streets for hours or days, and it's all too easy to resort to the sort of randomness that I was talking about earlier. We've all seen many thousands of street shots on the web which are of random people in random places doing random things. That random guy walking down the street, walking past a coloured wall and so on. It can just be a bit meaningless. There is no sense of narrative, no theme, no connection between the images. So to add real impact to your work, organise your shooting around projects. So a project is simply a collection of images which is generated around a specific theme with a kind of glue that bonds them all together as a body of work. And projects can provide you with a clear end game, whether it's in the form of a photo book, a set of prints, an exhibition, a web gallery, a blog, something that will spur you on to produce a tangible, worthy body of work. One of the most satisfying outcomes of a project is to share your work, and there's a real sense of achievement to see your images in a gallery, on a website, or maybe in the pages of a book. Zines are a very popular way currently to bring a project to life, and my latest zine contains a project shot in Venice, and these fantastic little booklets cost me £1.50 each to have them professionally printed, so we can all produce stuff like this. Here's an example of a project I'm working on. It's all about Soho, and in particular where the old Soho meets the new Soho. And this is a good example of a project. This is now my 3rd year into this project, and I think I probably got another year or so to go before I got enough material to make a book. But it's a good illustration of a project based on a fairly narrow theme, in this case, a small geographical area. So think project. My 6th tip is set it and forget it. Street photography shouldn't be complicated. In fact, from a technical perspective, things couldn't be simpler, and it's vital that you're in a state of constant readiness to be able to react quickly to scenes evolving around you. So I tend to set my camera up at the start of the day, and I don't touch these settings unless something major changes, like a big change in the light, for example. I really don't want to be faffing around with camera settings, wasting mental energy, which should be going into what is happening around me. Here's an approach that works for me, and this is how I set my camera up for street photography. And it's incredibly simple. Start off by setting your ISO to auto. And in your menu, you should be able to set a minimum shutter speed at which the shutter will fire in your auto ISO menu. Set that to something like a 200th or 250th of a second. Set the exposure mode to aperture priority. And then you need to set the aperture you want the camera to work at, and I set the aperture to f8. Always, pretty much always f8. This is a good compromise aperture. It lets a fair amount of light into the camera and it gives me a decent front to back sharpness or depth of field. This auto ISO option, provided you set your menu to give you this minimum shutter speed, will help minimize subject blur or camera shake, either of which will ruin or kill your shot. The tiny amount of extra noise caused by the ISO going too high, if that's what happens, is not going to kill your shot. It's a trade-off. So this small aperture, f8 or maybe f11 if it's a really bright day. So if I'm shooting somewhere like Lisbon, I will close it down to f11 or maybe f16, where you've got this brilliant light white. So this always helps with zone focusing, and which I'll talk more about in a second. So these settings are my walk around settings, and it's a compromise. It makes sure you get the shot 98% of the time. And sure, you can change things when you need to if you want some kind of a creative effect. But all my fine tuning now, I've set the camera up for my exposure. All my fine tuning is done using the exposure compensation dial. And this helps me retain detail in the highlights, to intensify shadow areas, to make the colors really pop. And if the light's behind me, I'll typically set it to one stop under by default. Simply on the exposure compensation dial, one stop under exposed, and this just gives me a lovely vibrancy to the colours. Now with certain cameras, like most of the Fujifilm X series cameras, the great thing is you've got all your exposure settings, you've got the exposure triangle all here on the top of the camera, on the top plate, and you don't need to delve into menus and buttons on the back to change things. And that's what I really love about these cameras. But yeah, having said all that, if you do come across a situation that doesn't work for those settings, then yeah, change them. I'm not saying that this isn't the be all and end all. Change them, but then change it back to your walk around settings when you need to. Keep it simple. So other settings, white balance, set it to auto, keep it simple. Dynamic range, I always set it to 100 because I never trust auto dynamic range. I use matrix metering. Some street photographers use spot metering, but I think it takes too much time and it takes your focus away from what really matters, which is focusing on the moment. Talking about focusing, in terms of focusing, I tend to switch off the autofocus and use manual focus using the zone focusing technique. And unfortunately, we haven't really got enough time today to explain this fully. But you'll find loads of blogs about it, loads of videos on YouTube that explain this technique, and I would thoroughly recommend using it. I never use autofocus, however good it is. I use it all the time and it really works. Zone focusing, check it out. Finally, on camera settings, in terms of film format, I usually shoot RAW, although I occasionally use some of the Fujifilm film simulations such as Acros or Classic Neg, which I think are gorgeous, but for me, it tends to be RAW all the way. So my next tip, get over your fears of street photography. Most of us have some level of discomfort with photographing people in the street, and we all deal with it in different ways. Some people fight the feeling and shoot away regardless. Some people just give up and start shooting something different like landscapes or still lifes. Maybe street photography is not for them. But others will learn a new set of skills to help them deal with any feelings of difficulty. And here are a few ways in which you can minimise your fears of shooting on the streets and invest plenty of time in working on this. The more you do it, the more comfortable you'll feel. Practice, practice, practice. So firstly, make street photography a habit. The more you're out there doing it, the better you'll feel about it. And this practice does lead to a sense of comfort and ease. Secondly, work quickly. Take your shot and move on. Don't linger. And work quietly. If your camera has bleeps and clicks and blinking lights that can be turned off, turn it all off. You don't need it for street photography. Thirdly, and this really is the killer tip, avoid eye contact. You won't find me making eye contact with people on the street. You don't need it. You'll find this whole thing much easier if you don't make eye contact with people. And this is before, during and after the shot. Okay, fourthly, always have confidence in the belief that you're not doing anything wrong. This is really important. You're not doing anything wrong, legally, morally, or ethically. And you need to keep telling yourself this. You'll certainly be more confident if you know the law. Street photography in a public place in the UK is perfectly legal, and you don't need anyone's permission to take their picture. And again, there is loads of stuff available out there on this, but just read up and just make sure that you are confident about it. But you don't need anybody's permission. You have perfect full rights to take pictures of people on the streets without their permission. So tip number 8, it's all about perfection. And I suggest you forget about it, okay? Chasing perfection will hold you back and you'll be concentrating on the wrong things. And I guess this is why street photography often doesn't do well in camera club competitions. Many judges just can't cope with things that are not perfect. Getting the shot the moment is what matters. And here's a quote from Gary Winogrand, which I think sums this whole thing up. So tip number 9, only use one lens for street photography. Use the same lens all the time. Get to know that lens intimately so that you instinctively know what it's seeing, so that you understand how it describes the world. My ideal lens for street photography is 35mm in full frame terms. So something like the 23mm on this Fujifilm camera is just about perfect. You just don't need masses of lenses. Okay, you might want to pack if you have interchangeable lenses, pack a wider lens in your bag because that's sometimes more fun. But 35mm in full frame terms is about as long as I would go. So why do I shoot wide angle? Well, a lens of say 35mm isn't too far from what the human eye sees, which is roughly a 70-degree angle of view. So when people look at your pictures taken with this lens, they're looking at reality. A wide angle will always get you physically closer to your subject as well. And this often brings more emotion and intimacy into the shot, and it really does come out in that shot. So on to my final tip for today, and that is make sure that you do things that inspire you. You've got to inspire yourself. Don't get obsessed with gear. Most photographers, me included, we love our gear and we love buying all the new stuff and buying more stuff and more stuff. And here I am in my loft. I can see from here 7 bags. I've probably got more in storage. We don't need all this gear. Most cameras, whatever your camera is, will do the job really well for you. But make sure you read lots of books. Spend your money on books like the 2 by me that I mentioned earlier. Visit galleries, do workshops, travel, analyse the work of the greats. There's just so much there to absorb, and a lot of it will just help make you a better street photographer. Take it all in. Well, that just about wraps it up. I hope you found this useful. Here are my contact details. If you'd like to know more about me or about Fujifilm, do check out some of these links. If you fancy doing a street photography workshop, I do about 60 to 70 of them every year in the UK and overseas. And I'd love to have you aboard. So just please do check out my website, streetsnappers.com, and also my YouTube channel, which is 100% street and packed with tips and inspiration. Well, that's all from me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon. Enjoy the rest of the show.